All right. Thanks for everyone who came today. Appreciate it. Hopefully you should see some slides up with some people skipping sort of on a lawn. And today we're talking about how to make movement meaningful. We're going to talk about this idea of the prescriptive emergent continuum. We'll just give a little bit of background on what we do and how we do things. So, Jill, do you want to do WildStrong intros?
Sure, just for
All right.
anyone that doesn't know who we are. We're WildStrong. Our main focus is to bring people outside to sort of connect with each other and our bodies and build capabilities so you can keep doing all of the things that you love to do and that you need to do. And to do that, we offer outdoor in-person classes and courses, some online courses, and we focus really on tools to build strength, skill, and connection. And really, our main focus is on expanding capabilities and expanding our options. Just a brief overview on who we are. Andrew, you can do yourself.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Andrew, I work as the head coach at WildStrong, and I've got a background. I sort of have a traditional fitness background. I did ACE, CSCS, Olympic lifting, CrossFit, um, course development for various personal training classes and modules and things like that. And I sort of became, I don't know, disenchanted with the fitness industry. So I left and I retrained in public health. Also did a lot of classroom teaching as well. And then around COVID, while I was inside doing spreadsheets and stuff and doing COVID surveillance tracking and things like that, I grew really jealous of Jill, who was outside and she had started a movement group. And I remember looking from the window, seeing everyone having a nice time. So I asked if I could join. And so Jill let me join WildStrong. So that's me.
Yeah, I'm Jill specifically. I don't have a formalized exercise background, and so we kind of, I guess my career prior to this was in communications, so kind of making complex messaging easy to understand. So that's why you see a lot of me on Instagram, and Andrew is on the podcast, which is more kind of long form. But within the Wild Strong context, I very much enjoy moving and have always enjoyed being outside. I don't enjoy exercise on my own, and so that's kind of why I'm really bad at doing the hard stuff on my own. So that's sort of where WildStrong grew out of, was looking at something that would be meaningful and enjoyable.
Come on.
And oh, there we go.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's where we kind of grew WildStrong from. There we go.
All
Oh
right.
yeah, just a note on this.
I want to do the apology because it's my fault.
Okay, you do the
Yeah.
apology.
So I am working with an artist who actually at first I was trying to find stock images on the internet and clip art and things like that, and I couldn't find anything. So I did what I normally don't do, and I went on ChatGPT and LLM and had it produce some images because I want to convey some ideas. Every single time I look at the AI images, I just feel a little bit bad because they're quite obviously AI. So I wanted to apologize for that, and I am currently working with an artist to do some nice watercolored images that I think should have a little bit more soul to them. So in the future, if we do this talk again, hopefully we'll have beautiful hand drawn, made by a real person. But
Um,
a lot of the images are really specific. So it's why we don't use a lot of photos. You notice Jill and I both have photos of our groups behind us. It's always nicer to have photos from the groups, but I've got some conceptual things, so I went over the dark side on that.
yeah, you'll know which ones are AI. There are some
Yeah, it
AI.
won't be. It'll be pretty obvious. So, I just wanted to apologize for that because if possible, I like to use real images or images that were created by a person.
Okay.
All right, and here, ooh, there's the AI. Okay, so I wanted to start, I guess, and I could probably just we could talk about this just in terms of anecdotes as well. But I wanted to start with an example that always jumped out at me. So back when I was doing teacher training and things like that, I got into John Holt, who wrote this book in the 1960s called How Children Learn. And he has this quote, which I'm partially paraphrasing here just for space, but he says, imagine if we taught speech like a school subject, sounds first, then syllables, then words, then grammar, all before conversations. He says most kids would give up long before they ever said a sentence. If we taught children to speak the same way we often teach movement by isolating, drilling parts, testing progress, limiting natural play, most would never learn to talk. So I want to step back and kind of unpack that. So Holt was talking about this tendency sometimes, especially in education, when we're trying to systematize and proceduralize teaching techniques, where a lot of what we often do is we break things down into their constituent parts. Sometimes people talk about this idea of reductionism. And, we have two kids ourselves, and it's been really interesting to see our children have very different brains and how they've handled reading and phonics and all these different things. And one of them ended up getting quite frustrated because the pedagogy they were using just didn't really work for his brain. And he got so frustrated that he had to learn how to read phonetically. When in fact, the way his brain worked, he just memorized the whole shapes of the words and just got going. And now he's like reading Harry Potter and things. But there was like a 2 or 3 year period where we didn't know if he was ever really going to enjoy reading. And it was really just a mismatch, I think, between the way he was being taught and how his brain was working. So John Holt, he was kind of saying it's like when we over formalize certain ways of teaching things, sometimes we can either strip out the joy of something or make it feel so technical or so abstract that people often end up growing up thinking that, oh, I don't like reading or I don't like movement, I don't like physical education, things like that. And I think often that's a reflection of how people are taught to move rather than any intrinsic preferences that people have. So this image right here, it's kind of playing along with the joke, and it's this idea of a kid who's supposed to be being taught how to walk, and the coach has this diagram in the background and saying, "Okay, I want you to hit this position. This foot goes up, and then this foot, and I want you to walk in this cadence." And it's just kind of this idea that often we can kind of strip out just the joy of movement by trying to turn it into a procedure. So that's really what we're going to talk about today, and then kind of how we try to attack that issue, and then also, when it's true and when it's not true. One of the reasons that the subtitle of this is talking about the prescriptive emergent continuum is also saying, you know what, sometimes it's totally okay to have a prescriptive teaching style, and sometimes that's what people want. Sometimes that's a way of helping them. It's not saying that you can never directly teach people, but also just helping people think about how you can create opportunities. So for the webinar today, we're going to talk about how people are often taught to move, or maybe traditional theories on movement motor skills. So maybe actually how people are taught to teach others to move. If anyone has ever worked with a personal trainer in a gym, sometimes you might see this disconnect between how capable you normally feel and you go to the gym and suddenly you might feel really disempowered because you're afraid you're doing this wrong or that wrong, or etc. We'll talk about some new ideas in movement, some of which are well over 100 years old, why this matters, how to apply this to real life, and then we'll give some additional resources and Q&A. Um, we only have about an hour today, so I put extra slides in specifically just so if people want to watch the video or look at it later. So I might just have a slide and say, well, you can look at this later. A lot of the slides are just meant to be evocative and to get you thinking. And this originally had AI images, but we figured we could actually get real ones. And the contrast here is this idea of hooking someone up to a treadmill and measuring all these different various KPIs and, excuse me, measurements and metrics like ground reaction forces and VO2 max and things like that. And that's very good for getting a specific kind of knowledge, but then also it sort of disembeds that knowledge from the real life environment, which is to say, down at the bottom, when people are actually walking or running, often they're doing it in a way where they're not running on a treadmill and everything isn't perfect and you can't control the temperature. Often people are walking across rocks or they're dodging things or it's wet or they could be walking for different reasons. And it's not to invalidate one kind of knowledge, that knowledge up top. It's just to pull back and think about why we do things certain ways and whether certain teaching styles or assumptions are appropriate for people in their everyday lives. So I do want to talk a little bit about how I learned to coach. And this is sort of a traditional way that I think now is starting to feel a little bit old-fashioned, at least in certain contexts. So when I was first learning how to, getting my personal training certification, and this is in the context of the gym, there's sort of this assumption that there's a correct way to do a movement. The PT or the coach, they know the correct way to do this movement. It's their job to transmit this technique to the client. And you do this through drilling, repetition, lots and lots of cues, lots of correction, and eventually you converge on this correct form. This is an example of in pedagogy what's often called teacher-centered learning, which is the idea that you have these class sort of these empty vessels who are waiting to be taught. And at the top in this hierarchy, you have the instructor. They have all this experience, all this knowledge, and what they're going to do is they're going to funnel that all into the waiting recipients, as opposed to more collaborative or learner-centered models where there's this idea that there's knowledge in the classroom and people can learn by doing from talking to each other. So you hear us say this quite a lot in a lot of our talks, but the difference between this idea of being the sage on the stage, you know, versus being the guide on the side. So this idea of imparting knowledge versus creating opportunities for people to learn. And that AI picture is just Plato giving someone a whole bunch of cues on a tennis serve and then getting all tangled up versus just giving someone an opportunity to try hitting a ball and then see what emerges. So I guess one of the questions is why do we do things this way? Because I don't want to draw this distinction and say this, this prescriptive way of teaching is always bad. It's not, and there are reasons why people do it. So one of the examples is down the bottom we have, and this is a two-part example. We have pictures of kids swimming in a swimming class. And if even though I think swim classes are so much better than they used to be, they have games, they're creative, they have toys, they have all these things. But Jill and I, we had this experience. We were bringing our kids to swimming lessons for years, and they never learned how to swim. And they didn't like it. It didn't feel playful. It felt like something they had to do, even though I'm not saying the teachers were bad. They weren't. They were just, they had like, specific limitations. Then we were lucky enough to spend a summer in Florida with my family. They had a pool. The kids spent whatever it was, 3 or 4 weeks just, swimming. And without being taught formally, they finally learned how to swim. They learned how to play. They were jumping in and out of the pool. They developed, all this confidence in a way that's just not really possible. But then on the other hand, not everyone has access to swimming pools, So it's great to say that everyone should just go out and swim because really that's probably how most people would learn. But then also you need to think about what are the real constraints. So why do we do things this way? A lot of times when we're teaching teachers, we want to create procedures and three-step systems. So a lot of times whenever we're doing a train the trainer thing, people want to be taught an ABC system because that is easier to scale up, and a lot of the nuances get lost in that. There's a lot of teacher-centric assumptions, especially in different cultures. There's a lot of cultures where people want to look at the teacher or the coach as the font of all knowledge, and that can create some issues. Sometimes there's issues of what's called internal validity for research purposes, which means that when you're trying to do like a randomized controlled trial or some kind of observational study, you need to keep things the same, which means you need to write down specific procedures for how things are done. And then that gets, sometimes we lose the forest through the trees. We assume that's the best way to do it. And also just this expectation of learners. Like I said, sometimes people want to be taught directly. So we'll cover all that. What I do want to address is this traditional model, this idea of information processing. So, a lot of the ways, even when if people were taught in PE or any kind of skill acquisition, in the 90s and the 2000s and the 2010s, they'd be taught this sort of traditional model of information processing. And this is the idea that we have a brain. The brain is a control center. Movement is sort of like the final output. Errors are problems to be corrected. So anytime someone's making a mistake, that needs to be corrected right away. This idea of good form is something that's predefined and ideal, and the coach's role is to diagnose, correct, and cue. So a lot of times you might see analogies about the CEO who's managing everything from the top, or this idea that our brain is a computer. And there's this idea that the way we learn skills is that we learn all like millions and millions and millions of different pre-learned motor tasks. Like this is the good tennis serve, this is the good backhand, this is how you kick a ball. And then your body taps into them or your brain taps into them when it needs it. And, when I say it this way, it sounds a little bit silly because I think we see that model can fall apart very quickly. Sometimes this is called the homunculus problem. Um, and it assumes that we memorize all these different patterns, and there's this part in your brain itself, that tells you when to do these scripted motor patterns. The problem is this discounts the fact that we're a complex system of systems and we have all this feedback. It's not, our brain isn't just this little homunculus in a jar. Our body and our brain is really more distributed. So we get feedback from our hands, our ears, our tactile senses, our vestibular senses. All these different things are happening at the same time. It doesn't all go back to your brain to get processed. Actually, what it is your body experiences this as a whole, and then it reacts to it. Um, and one of the examples that I might use when we're talking about this is you could tell somebody how to walk on ice. I could say, here, I've written up a set of instructions. If you've never walked on ice before, here's what you have to do. When you're walking on ice, what you want to do is maybe you want to get a little bit lower and you want to make sure you get your center of gravity over yourself. And then when you take steps, instead of taking big running steps, you want to make sure you keep the steps under your feet. And all that's well and good. But someone's not really going to know how to walk on ice until they experience what it's like. And then through experiencing the walking on ice, they'll come up with their own movement solutions that work based on the issue. And sometimes this is a distinction between what's called techne and metis, which is this idea of book learning versus experiential learning. Metis being the experiential learning. There's a long quote, but I'm going to read it because it's very good. I think a good example of this is Rafael Nadal, and this is from his 2011 autobiography. He says, "You might think that after millions and millions of balls I've hit, I'd have the basic shots of tennis sewn up. But it isn't. Not just because every day you wake up feeling differently, but because every shot is different, every single one. From the moment the ball is in motion, it comes at you at an infinitesimal number of angles and speeds with more topspin, backspin, flatter, higher. There's so many other factors, the weather, the surface, the rival. No ball arrives the same as another. No shot is identical. And that's real life. Real life is complex. Nothing is ever the same. So this idea that you can learn this one specific motor pattern doesn't really map up. And we've known this since at least the 1960s or before. Um, uh, a motor learning specialist called Nikolai Bernstein, he has this term called repetition without repetition. And this idea that skill acquisition comes from repeating the process of solving a problem rather than repeating. So here, what he did is he hooked up different craftsmen. He was measuring their motion, and he was looking at master craftsmen versus less experienced ones. And what he actually found is the movement variability was higher in, say, like a master blacksmith, for example, because they had so many more subtle different movements and they were reacting to the world around them rather than just trying to make the same hit over and over and over again. These two examples I took from Rob Gray's book, which I'll reference a lot. It's called How We Learn to Move. So that anyone who's read that book will recognize a lot of the examples that I'm using. So basically, this homunculus is this idea that you have this little computer living inside your head telling you what to do. And this is all the traditional view. There's a little coach in your head. The brain acts like a central computer. There's a mini you who watches you, controls everything. You need to consciously plan and correct your movements. Movement errors come from bad instructions or bad plans. And often this can lead to overthinking, performance anxiety. Anyone who's ever been overcoached or has accidentally overcoached someone has realized all of a sudden if someone gives you too many cues on how to do something or not do something, then people get stuck in their heads. And sometimes you see this kind of analysis paralysis that often wouldn't happen if people just had the space to play around and figure things out for themselves. Um, and this is in contrast to what we're going to talk about more about today, this ecological model, with this idea that movement emerges from interaction. So movement is distributed across the brain, the body, and the environment. It's this constant relationship between all of those. There's no inner watcher. You don't have a little CEO in your head. Your body's just reacting as things happen. It's really a process of attunement. I really like this idea of attunement or calibration, where your body attunes to the environment based upon the challenges and the tasks that it's dealing with. Errors are just a part of learning. It's one of the great ways that we learn this idea of differential learning is that you learn from errors, and often you can learn more from doing something incorrectly than from trying to repeat the same thing correctly over and over and over again. So just this idea of trying to get people to be responsive, confident, adaptable, really give people the tools so they can feel good about self-organizing, solving their own problems, getting away from this idea of mental blueprints. And that really means the role of the coach is going to be more about providing experiences and challenges versus pre-programmed challenges, pre-programmed patterns. There's a paper that came out last year, the first time I gave this talk. It just came out the same month, and I thought this one was really good. It's called The Myth of Optimality, and it's really talking about specifically in biomechanics. And I think once you have this idea, it becomes so obviously true that it's hard to not think about it. And what this paper is arguing is that any movement like walking is going to solve multiple simultaneous goals. Okay. So you could say, okay, when we're walking, maybe we're trying to walk for energy efficiency. Maybe we're trying to walk for speed. Maybe we're trying to get there as fast as possible. Maybe it's slippery and we're going to try to walk to maximize stability. Maybe we're carrying something. Maybe we have an injury or we're trying to avoid an injury. Maybe it's a form of social signaling. People can walk different ways. People can walk to signify confidence. People can walk when they want to talk, when they want to show they're angry. If you've ever had a kid or a teenager, they have a very specific stroppy walk to let you know that they're really unimpressed with you right now. And for a biomechanist to come in and say, this is the optimal way to walk, well, that only makes sense if we can think about the why. The way that, like, a young male might be walking in London to signify that they're a tough guy, that you don't want to mess with them, is not the same way that a speed walker in the Olympics is going to walk. So whenever we talk about this idea of optimality, it assumes that everyone's on the same page for why we're doing something. And I think this is really important, that this idea that biomechanics and kinematics can't capture the why or the context of something. And this also comes up a lot when we talk about sports. And sometimes Jill and I will use this idea or this word sportification, which is an ugly word, and then another ugly word, which is proceduralization. Um, and kind of what that is sometimes certain movements or standards get grandfathered in as being a good movement or a bad movement, and people don't really think about the why. So if you look at the center, the man in the red t-shirt, who's doing a barbell back squat, he's doing what's considered a traditional low bar powerlifting back squat. If anyone's ever read Mark Ripto's book, this is kind of the back squat that he would recommend. And there was a long period in the mid 2000s up until just a few years ago where if you weren't doing this kind of squat in certain circles, people would say, no, you're squatting wrong. But people never really interrogated the why. This is a specific squat that makes sense with a specific implement, the barbell, with a specific loading, with a specific goal, with a specific sport, which is powerlifting. It doesn't mean that this is the best squat for everything. It might not necessarily be the best squat for you based on your body type. And off to the left here, I have this picture of what's called the deep knee bend. And this is the way that a lot of like turn the century, 19th going to early 20th century strongmen and bodybuilders would have trained. And you see their heels are off the ground. They've got their knees pointing away from them. They're up on their toes. And at one point, this might have been considered the correct way to squat. But really, the important thing is why. Over to the right, I've got an example of a much maligned movement, the CrossFit style pull-up. This is a butterfly pull-up. And when CrossFit was really popular in the mid 2000s and the 2010s, people would make fun of them because they would have these events where you'd have to do a certain amount of pull-ups in time or, whatever the challenge was. And they found an efficient way of doing a pull-up where they had this restriction. Look, you have to get your chin over the bar. You have to do as many pull-ups as possible. So they figured out that they could do the cyclical movement called a butterfly pull-up or a kipping pull-up, depending on your style. And they could knock out 30, 40 pull-ups in a row. And people are like, no, that's not a pull-up. Well, it depends on the why. Are you using this pull-up to build strength? Or are you using it to win in this competition, which said you need to get your chin over the bar as many times in a row? Down on the left, there's a period where everyone was really afraid that you had to squat or you had to lunge in a specific pattern, even though all the time in sports we see all these patterns that are considered non-optimal biomechanically. So here's a picture of a fencer, but we could look at curling? Yeah, curling. In the Winter Olympics, where you have the stones and you launch them out. It's almost like lawn bowling or bocce or something like that. And if you look at the positions that they get into all these positions that people would say are non-optimal. Last two examples is this was a recent article from New York Times down in the middle, and it's talking about the popularity of high rocks, but how high rocks, there's this big controversy right now because they're supposed to do this movement, a wall ball. And with the wall ball, you're supposed to get your hips down to a certain level, otherwise it doesn't count. So the problem is that there's a mismatch between the task, which is people are trying to launch a ball up and hit a certain target, but then also they have an additional rule. So people are saying, well, you're cheating, but it depends. You have to ask about the why. And then the last one is from Olympic weightlifting. I'm thinking specifically about the rule where if you're doing what's called a jerk, you're not allowed to press straight up overhead for purposes of judging. You have to do what's called a jerk, where you have to come down and quickly punch it up and extend your arms through a downward motion and then lock out. And if you don't do it correctly, then you won't get points, which at some level is an efficient movement. But other ways, if you lose your medal because you don't use the right thing, and what I'm saying, the whole point of all these things is there's always this debate about if you're doing things wrong or right, but we never look at the context of what people are trying to achieve. It could be the good or bad form could be different depending on the sport, the goals, on the body type, on the organizations. So, quite famously, people have these manual handling classes they do in HR in big organizations. I used to have to do them for NHS, where they'd say, okay, well, you have to pick up a box this specific way, and you're not allowed to pick up a box if it weighs more than whatever is 8 kg or something. And that has no bearing on reality. That just has bearing on company controlling liability. But sometimes people take these points and they think that they actually reflect real life needs or capacities of people, when in fact they almost end up being arbitrary. So this is a tension between what's sometimes called task-based and rules-based coaching. So again, this idea of the myth of optimality, just imagine this guy's walking down the street, and he's just trying to get to school, but there's a bunch of Olympic judges there who are giving him low scores because he's not walking right. So one of the tensions in this coaching, this prescriptive coaching, it's an old debate that people talk about a lot, and it's this tension between learning versus performance, or what sometimes might be called immediate coach dependent performance versus long-term adaptable skill. Um, and what it is sometimes if you're say like a tennis coach and you have someone repeat the same serve over and over and over again, from your point of view, they could be performing better because their serve is more aligned with what you want them to look like. But when it comes time for them to actually play, all that might fall out the window and they might actually not be a better long-term player. So even though they might have more immediate short-term performance, in the long run, actually, maybe it doesn't transfer to whatever their task is, whatever they're trying to do. Um, and then, just this idea that sometimes people fall in this idea that our brain is a computer. Brain is not a computer. We're not trying to do a whole bunch of calculations. So that picture, someone's throwing a stick to the dog, and the dog's like, "Hang on, let me just quickly do some quick algebra here, just to see what the parabola of the stick is going to be." That's not how we learn. Is you throw things at people, and then they get a sense of how things move. They're not doing math in their head. People are always like, "Oh, yeah, it's amazing when people throw and catch because." They're doing all this complex calculus. People aren't doing calculus. That's not how the brain works. You can learn calculus, and that can be something that overlaps with reality, but they're really two different things. Um, so there have been a lot of ideas that have been challenging some of these old ideas, some of these old prescriptive ideas. And I just want to, if you are interested, I'd recommend you look into what's called 4E cognition. Maybe people have heard of the book Intelligence in the Flesh by Guy Claxton, but it's just this idea that thinking is embodied, so it's distributed throughout the entire body, not just the brain. Your hands and feet and sensory organs are all part of it. Cognition is embedded, so context and limitations placed in the body by external environment. So it makes sense in the environment around it, which is why you can't take someone's brain, put it in a jar, attach it to a computer, and expect things to work the same way. We could also talk about AI on that. Is the idea that cognition is extended. So through tools like writing or language or abacus or something like that, we can sort of externalize our thoughts and interact with the world around us. And also this idea that it's enactive, which is argument that cognition is a dynamic process that's constantly reacting to everything around it. There's big emphasis on complexity rather than just memorizing certain heuristics. So and more and more science seems to be bearing this out. I've got this article down here that just came. It's from March 13th, and it just says single-celled organism with no brain is capable of Pavlovian learning. And it's just saying that, like a lot of these ideas, is that our brain, our cognition, our sense of consciousness all evolved from movement first. And that really seems to be where all the evidence is pointing is that even organisms that don't really have traditional brains are still capable of learning because they're reacting to the world around them. So often movement isn't something that's top-down control, it's something that emerges from our body working in conjunction with the environment and what it's reacting to. So all this can be tied up into this idea of the ecological dynamics model, which is that movement emerges from interaction of a person, task, and environment. We perceive affordances. So not just things aren't just objects with no value, they're opportunities for action. So the classic example is if you are going to a Starbucks or something like that, and you see a door and it has a big giant handle and it says push, 99% of people are not going to look at the sign that says push. They're going to pull on that big handle because the handle is inviting them to pull. And it's this idea the environment is the teacher, where you can put all the signs you want on things, but ultimately people are going to interact with the environment based on the invitations. And this is true, if you think about how kids use space and they play, or how people like parkour in the city, how they, or maybe skateboarders, how they're invited by the environment to use different sculptures and public works and things like that to play with it in a way, even if that environment was never specifically designed for that purpose. So just this idea that skill learning is nonlinear, it's adaptive, it's messy. So that I have this picture of the tree here, and this idea that when trees grow, they're reacting to the environment around them. So we have a bunch of beech trees over by our house, and they're all gnarled, and they almost look like bonsai trees, and that's because they grew up in that environment. Organisms reflect the environment they grow into. They're reacting to the environment. Um, so this idea of having like a perfect plan often falls apart in the real world. Um, so I want to talk about a few technical things, and then I'm going to open it up for some questions because I think I've been talking a lot. So I just want to draw attention to this idea of perception action coupling as well, which is this idea that we learn from interacting with the environment and through representative tasks based on movement, not repeating arbitrary drills. And the reason I have a picture of this woman boxing a robot is you see this over and over and over again. You see all these very specific apps or very, very expensive gadgets. Sometimes professional sports teams or militaries, they'll buy these things that are supposed to improve reaction time. So it'll be something like, okay, you're sitting at a computer screen. Whenever you see a green light, hit this button. Whenever you see a red light, hit this button. And this idea that general reaction speed can be improved, but that's not how reaction works. Reaction isn't these arbitrary stimuli. It's embedded. It's all these clues in what's happening around you. So I'll give an example on the next one. There's this famous case of Jenny Fitch, who's a softball pitcher in the 2000s, and what she would do is she would go around America and she would strike out professional baseball players and be like, "Oh, isn't this amazing? She's so fast. She's striking out these players, and her overall pitching speed and power, were lower than American professional pitchers in baseball. It's a different style of pitch. It's an overhand pitch in baseball, an underhand pitch in softball." But it wasn't about the speed. It's that when someone is batting in American baseball, they're not reacting to the ball itself because that would be way, way too fast. You're not going to be able to hit a 97 mile an hour fastball by watching the ball. What you're doing is you're reacting to the pitcher, how the pitcher sets up, how they twist, where their hand goes. It's the same if you've ever played table tennis or tennis. You know where the shot's going before you see the ball because you see all the clues in the setup and the context around it. So this idea that someone could get better at boxing reaction by blinking different lights, that's not it. You're reacting to the shift of the person's hips. You're reacting to what they're reacting to, how they telegraph a move. So really what we're talking about is this idea of transferable skill. Transferable skill is developed in the context of real situations with all their subtle details. And I think this is the forest that gets lost through the trees sometimes, or maybe the cart that's getting put before the horse or whatever, where sometimes we focus so much on these specific movements, especially in gym contexts, where we don't actually ask, is there any skill transfer? Is this helping the person in real life? Is this actually meaningful to them? And often what we find is you want to have this rich variability of doing things out in the real world, doing the thing itself. So this contrast between the guy running on the treadmill and the woman who's doing some trail running, she's reacting to the slope, all the different rocks in front of her. No single step is looking the same. As opposed to running on a treadmill, where the idea is that every single step is supposed to look the same. A better example might be this example that I stole from Rafe Kelly. He's got a blog on this that's very good. And he uses the example of, imagine you've got two brothers, okay, and they want to get better at pull-ups. Or we could say two sisters in this example. You got two sisters, and one of them decides that she's going to do a dedicated pull-up program. So every single morning she gets up and she does her 20 minutes of pull-up variations. The other sister decides that she's going to join a bouldering gym. So maybe 3 or 4 times a week she goes to a bouldering gym and she just practices bouldering and all these different things. At the end of the year, they're both going to improve their pull-ups. Um, the sister who does the pull-up specific program, maybe she'll have gotten more pull-ups. Maybe she'll have achieved 10 really good pull-ups. And maybe the sister who is doing the bouldering, only achieves, I don't know, 6 pull-ups or something like that. But she's going to have all these other skills that she's developed along the way, different kinds of strength from different angles, mobility, ability to read a rock face and things like that. And that's going to have much, much more carryover. If you ask them to go ahead and climb a tree, the person who's been doing the bouldering is going to be much, much better at climbing trees, even if their max number of pull-ups is lower, because it's not about isolating these individual parts. It's about putting it all together in a transferable skill. Um, so I guess I'm going to take a little break right here. I'm going to open it up because I've been talking a lot, and I think it's a nice time just to take a break and just to get some people's reactions from this. So I'm not just fire hosing you with ideas. So I'm going to take a break right here and see if anyone has any questions. If you want to drop some questions in the chat, that's fine. If you have a real pressing question you really want to ask right now, you can take yourself off mute as well if you want.
Yeah, I'll ask something, Andrew, for me. I work as a sports massage therapist and often have a dilemma of I see somebody come in with an injury. Maybe they're training for a marathon and they've
Yeah.
been up in there running a lot, let's say. And do I try and encourage them to change their form? Is there such a thing as good running form, or is it just a case of it's gonna happen and I just need to treat it and let them go out and get on with it again? What are your
Yeah,
thoughts
that
on that?
so it's interesting. There are some studies on this. I don't have them in the I don't have them right here, but remind me later. I can share them with you on
Hmm.
Circle. Um, it does look like when if people have developed a certain form for running, it
Hmm.
does look like if you try to change that form dramatically, whether through pose running or chi running or whatever model of running people have, that the injury rate does tend to go up after people change their form. Now, I'm not saying that in the long run it might work better, um, but a lot of times we don't always know why people have a certain form. So what I mean is when I run, I'm a famously ugly runner. And I turn my toes out when I run. And people say, "Oh, you shouldn't turn your toes out when you run because it's going to put more stress on your medial ligaments, and you're not going to have good alignment and things like this." And all that is true. But also, if you look at the way my hips are shaped, where my hip sockets kind of go out and back. So in order for me to get it so my knees and my toes are aligned, then actually what I have to do is I have to kind of wrench myself into this really extreme, almost exaggerated internal rotation. So even though my running will look better to the outside observer, actually, whenever I try to run that way, my knees hurt and everything just feels bad. I feel less efficient. My time goes down. So it's really hard to say. And then with injuries, injuries are really complex. And there's this idea um, called the overuse variability hypothesis, which is this idea that actually, like a lot of the injuries we get, a lot of the long-term injuries we get, especially in repetitive sports, like certain kinds of running, so running on a treadmill in this case, or cycling or swimming or whatever, things like that. A lot of these injuries come from overuse when people try to recreate this perfect ideal form every time.
Hmm.
Whereas if people have a bit more variability in how they move, often their long-term injury rate might go down. So a good example as well, I'll use myself as well, is I was taught to squat in a very, very specific way. And whenever I squatted differently, my coach at the time said, well, that's not optimal. You're losing power here. You're not creating as much torque and things like that. But every single time I squat the way I was supposed to, my hips just hurt. And I forced myself to do it. I forced myself to do it. And my hips just started hurting more and more and more. And then I'm like, well, why am I even squatting this much? So instead of trying to squat this one way, I started incorporating offset squats, staggered positions, toes in, toes out, heels elevate, heels not. And now my hips aren't, at 42, my hips feel so much better than when I was 25, when I was trying to do things optimally. So we don't often know why people self-organize in certain ways. And you'll have more insight to this, because you work as a massage therapist, so you'll have more of a sense of the internal structures of people. But like we don't know how people's shoulders are going to be shaped. We don't know the shape of their acromion. We don't know whether people are going to have retroverted hips. And a lot of these things you can't really tell unless you do certain kinds of scans. So for me personally, if somebody's doing something a certain way, I tend not to overtly correct them. But what I might try to do, if I think there's a more efficient way, what I might try to do is I might try to set up opportunities for them to find new techniques, for them to find new ways of moving and see if they can find a more efficient option. This is what's sometimes called people hit these attractor states where they hit these certain forms. They do them over and over and over again. What
Okay.
they would say in ecological dynamics is what you want to do is you want to perturb the system. You want to create an opportunity for them so they can learn more efficient ways of doing things. That the bad thing from your point of view as a massage therapist is that it's it's very hard to do that by telling. Do you know what I mean? Whereas it might be that if you gave them an opportunity to like, well, try running on the beach, try running on sand, try doing some trail running, try
Yeah.
using different kinds of shoes, and then that feedback might elicit a change in form. Whereas telling someone, I don't know what, maybe telling someone to do more of a forefoot strike than a rear foot strike or something like that. It's really hard to get good results because people focus on just what the movement looks like, and then they can ignore the feedback of what the physics are giving them, if that makes
Cool.
sense.
That's a really good answer, I think. Yeah. I
Yeah.
think personally, I found if you try sprinting, that can help improve your general running form, or barefoot trainers, just gets you thinking about it differently. So yeah, that's basically what I'm
That's a
saying.
great point. Getting
Yeah.
people to do sprinting if it's appropriate, or
Hmm.
what we've been doing at our local WildStrong is we found a really nice hill and we started sprinting uphill, which though it sounds more intimidating, is actually tends to be a little bit safer for people because it
Hmm.
kind of prevents people from overstriding and things like that. And already I've just noticed since I've started doing that regularly that my other running that I do in the morning just feels more peppy. So I think I've been learning a lot from it. It's the adage of let the environment be the teacher,
Sure.
is what I would say if possible.
Okay.
Just to say, Rachel, hi Rachel, just said that chatty sparkly runners help runners tune into running and their own ability and fitness. It's very mindful, so there's no emphasis on form and more on tuning into to feeling based running. So I'm gonna have a look them up.
Um,
I'm gonna look them up.
that makes a lot of sense. I mean, that's really in line with what I would say.
I think also at this point we can keep going saying, but I think there's a because social media really pushes this really simplistic message of everything. There's so much content that talks about a very specific way to do a thing on social media because it's so tidy. And quite often it's just not, I'm just thinking particularly about the sort of sit to stand test that just does the rounds every 6 months because it's a really easy thing to film and people can do it or not do it and it can look really cool on social media, but ultimately it's kind of absurd for most people because it's just not a useful thing. So I do think in maybe in the last few years that it has got skewed again in terms of like really overly simplistic messaging around what you should and shouldn't be doing.
All right. If there are any other questions, I'm happy to take them. Otherwise, I'll kind of continue and I'll get to the wrap up point so we can talk about what to do about it all. All right. Um, so the reason I have this image here, this is supposed to be Socrates talking to a martial arts class, sort of asking Socratic questions. And sometimes we have this issue, and I was alluding to it earlier. Because I would say, well, often it's better to present questions or challenges and let people learn on their own rather than giving a top down. But the problem is that sometimes there are expectations for how people want to be taught. So this is quite a famous paper now, and it's called "There Must Be an Ideal Solution: Assessing Training Methods of Knife Defense Performance of Police Recruits." And this one was actually done in Germany. And what they were looking at is they were looking, or I think what they found is that there's sometimes there is a bit of a distance between what people expect will be more effective and what is often more effective. So a lot of times when people do martial arts classes, they're taught in kata, or they're taught forms. So they'll say, okay, if someone comes at you with a knife like this, you do this, and then you do this, and then you do this. And you memorize these 4 or 5 steps. And what we see is those techniques actually really don't work in real life. Martial arts will call this lacking the quality of aliveness. This reactivity, this adaptability. If you memorize 4 or 5 steps in a row, that's just not how life works. It just becomes too complex. But that's what people expect when they're being taught martial arts, is they like to have these 3 or 4 step movements. So what these researchers did in Germany is they had two different cohorts, and they were teaching knife defense to police officers. In one group, they were doing the traditional step one, step two, step three defense. In the other group, they were using more non-linear pedagogy, where they were letting people play and giving them markers and having them come up with different techniques where they would try to hit each other with the marker, or sometimes they would do something where they were just in the classroom and someone would run into the classroom with a fake knife, and they'd go after people, and people would have to come up with their own solutions on the fly. And at the end, of the two cohorts, the group that was taught traditionally, this traditional martial arts method of step one, step two, step three, they were much happier with it. They felt it was more effective. They felt like they had learned more. But when you actually measured the group that was taught in this non-linear way, they actually developed much more effective techniques that worked during the test, and they retained it for much, much longer. So there's this disconnect because people expect to be taught formally, even though often that formal teaching isn't going to be best for long-term learning. But that is the problem, is because when people come to certain classes and things, they want to be taught, and if they're not taught explicitly, sometimes they become unhappy with it. So we have this idea, the prescriptive emergent continuum, which is something we developed, but it's also something that if you look down here, this is an example from a textbook where they talk about this. So we really pulled this idea from the book down below, the constraints-led approach. And this prescriptive emergent continuum is this idea that when you're teaching, you can't say, look, I'm going to do this purely emergently, or purely based on constraints-led ecological theories, but also probably it's not going to be best to do it completely prescriptively. And there are different tools for different jobs. So generally prescriptive is if we're talking about teaching someone a specific skill they might not figure out on their own. A lot of this rules based. So if you're teaching someone to a sport or something where you might have judges deciding if you're doing it right or wrong, it's usually top down. It's teleological, which means you have this end form in mind, and you're trying to get people to work towards that end goal. A lot of direct teaching, a lot of recreating the perfect form, a lot of working towards optimal, however you want to define that, often makes sense in competition or quantification. Whereas emergent is more about exploration, this idea of task-based movement, so kind of giving people challenges and seeing how they solve it. This idea of facilitation, so again, being the guide on the side rather than the sage on the stage. More qualitative, a lot more work on playing, gaming, problem solving, self-organization. And obviously, from the way that I've been talking, I really like this emergent style, but it's not going to be perfect for everyone because sometimes people, when they're first learning, they want more support or they want to get more feedback and things like that. And that's why it's a continuum. There are times when, people just might want to have their hand held and be told what to do until they can develop the confidence and the skill to do things on their own. So I talk about this a little bit in one of the podcasts, number 28, with Jarlo Alano. And he talks about this analogy of a guitar, and he's like, the play-based emergent stuff is great, but you need to think about people's current capabilities. And he uses the example. He says you couldn't just hand someone a guitar and tell them to like rip out a smoking guitar solo, because if you don't know how to play, you don't have the ability to even improvise. You lack the basic skills. So you really want to make sure that you build up confidence and competence first, and then that's going to beget play and exploration. So they do need that base level of competence of knowing how to use their bodies before they go out and do this. And luckily, most people already know how to use their bodies because they live in a physical world. And then sometimes also just people want the initial support and structure. So we talk about a lot of this, and if you're interested in this idea, we kind of talk about it down below. There's some podcasts episodes that are relevant, so you can look those up later. Um, the way we navigate this continuum is we do spend lots of time on task-based stuff and lots of time on more prescriptive stuff, and it sort of depends on who we're working with and what the goals are. So, for example, on one end, we have an online strength course that's called Strong for Life, and that's really prescriptive. That's really classic gym. Here's how you do this position. Here's how you do this position. Here's how you do this movement. But we do that for a reason because we're working often with older women who either have been diagnosed with osteopenia or osteoporosis or low bone mineral density. And what they really want to do is they want to be told exactly how to do things, specifically, what does the research say? And what's the evidence base on this? So we do it that way. And the goal is that over time, once they gain that confidence and the competence, we can move them more into that task-based exploratory sphere. Um, in our in-person courses, we really explore the continuum between both. And then we have other options like confidence and motion, where we work on balance and falls, which we start working towards more of the task base with some prescriptive. Um, and then all the way on the other end, we have Nature Moves, which is our play-based program that we do, not just with older adults. We work with various populations that maybe don't have a lot of opportunities to engage in physical activity. But the group that we do locally is generally adults 65 and over, and that's completely play-based. And I guess that's the other anecdote that I want to talk about, which is we didn't just come up with all this stuff theoretically. This is a lot of stuff that we had to learn. Like I said, I've been doing this for, I don't know, approaching 20 years now. And I remember the first time I did a class with older adults, and I had all these list of things that older adults are supposed to do. It's like, okay, I want to make sure that we get some hinging motions. I want to make sure that we get some knee dominant squatting motions. I know that get down get ups are good, so maybe I'll do some Turkish get ups. All these gym movements I had memorized. And then as soon as I got there, I realized all these assumptions were completely inappropriate because some people had sore knees, some people had sore hips, some people had sore wrists, some people couldn't get down to the ground, some people couldn't bend this joint. And this idea of coming to a group of people and saying, I want you to do these movements because these are supposed to be the best movements, it immediately didn't make sense. And I realized the only way to engage a group of people is by presenting them with challenges and tasks and seeing what they come up with and seeing how you can build up their confidence so they can come up with more solutions over time. And it's a sort of thing where there's just a complete mismatch between one way of thinking, the sort of traditional gym logic way of thinking, and actually working with people in the real world. And that was really the impetus for a lot of our thinking down the road, is we just realized that some of our assumptions were inappropriate. Um, so, big takeaways here: design challenges, don't just provide answers. Give time and space to explore and create a culture of exploration. Challenge but support. Queuing is fine. There's no rule that you can't help people find a better solution, but really think about your why. And what I mean is, I think new coaches sometimes they want to demonstrate their value by telling people do all these things, do it this way, straighten your back, move your knee in this angle. You think, is that actually empowering for people, or is that just sort of taking away their sense of agency? Consider people's expectations and always learn and reiterate as you go. Always ask why and think about how you can do it better over time. Jill, do you want to jump in or do you want to keep on going?
You can keep going. I just thought it was just to give people an example of within a different class setting, what one might look like over the other. So
Yeah.
this, yeah, you can,
Okay, I,
yeah,
I
you
I can
can
go.
do
That's fine. So, we want to give an example of what this actually looks like. So, this is something we do in our different classes, and these different examples would sort of fall at different parts on that continuum. Up in the top right, I have this Turkish getup, and I just pulled this off the internet. And what you can see here is this is really one side of a very prescriptive continuum. So you'll see all these things. Keep the wrist straight. Put your foot here. Make sure your arm is aligned this way, 90 degrees from the floor. Keep your shoulder in the socket. Don't lean the kettlebell forward to help you pull up. Sit up correctly. All these different things, because the Turkish getup, while it is a good movement, it's a sort of movement that somebody identified once and then they tried to codify it. And when you try to teach people the Turkish get up, when I teach it formally, it has something like 15 or 16 different steps that you're supposed to memorize and then convey to people. And I'm not saying that's wrong, but what I'm saying is if I'm working with a group of people, I say this is how you have to pick things up, automatically it's going to limit a lot of people. Um, or the different ways that people might pick up a sandbag. You can do it really formally, with more of a formal kind of deadlift position, or you can do it more in an exploratory way. So sometimes the way that we handle this, depending on the group, is instead of doing prescriptive pickups, what we do are emergent pickups. And what we do is we provide a challenge or the context, and then we see how people solve that problem. So I don't know if I'll demo this, but we'll think about it. So the first one, and this is just something that came out of real life. Once he wasn't 6 at the time, but our 6-year-old son, he had this habit, or maybe he was 6 at the time, because he's 7 now, where he'd always crawl into our bed when we were working, and he'd fall asleep in our bed, and we'd get ready to go to bed, and we had a 6-year-old lying in the middle of the bed. And it's the kind of thing where if I went to a gym, they'd say, well, what you do is you do a deadlift. But when you're walking on top of a bed trying to pick up a 6-year-old, not like, no, you can't do a deadlift. It doesn't make any sense. You're not, they're not a barbell, so you're not able to like grab them like that. So what do you actually have to do? What you have to do is you end up getting quite low. You sit next to them and you very gently you take the kid and you kind of roll them onto your chest. And then what you do is you kind of post up and you stand up and you do something that looks very much like a Turkish get up, except nobody has to teach you to do it because the constraint is you've got this heavy wiggly object. You don't want to wake them up. How can you pick them up gently, pick them up and then put them back in their bed? So we'll do this with our group, but we'll have different size sandbags. And we'll say, imagine it's a baby. You have to pick it up without waking it up. What would you do with it? And all of a sudden, emergently, people come up with all these techniques that are just like some of the techniques you might find on the very explicit Turkish getup example, except they come up with it on their own, almost sort of spontaneously. They come up with these solutions. The one in the middle is something that I was thinking about once when we were staying at a family member's house and they had a big party the night before and I got up early and I was cleaning and I realized it was recycling day. And I had all these bins and bins and bins of just like disgusting old cans of beer and wine and stuff like that. And I was trying to pick them up and carry them to get them to the street before the bin men came. But also, I didn't want to get all the old beer and wine and stuff on my shirt. So sometimes we'll do this example where we'll have different shaped objects and say, well, like imagine it's a bin, or better yet, imagine it's a dog. Imagine you have a dog and it's just rolled around in some muck or it's found some sheep poo or something like that, and you need to carry it over to the bath. How would you pick it up in such a way so you don't get it close to your body? And that's the same thing. All these other things emerge. So what we do is we try to elicit this behavior. By introducing these constraints in a story. And the last one that we do quite a lot, and this is if we were trying to get people to do overhead stuff, is we say, well, I want you to imagine that you're in a flood and you've just gone ahead and you dropped your wedding ring down into the water below you, but you also have your mobile phone. So you want to keep your mobile phone dry while you're picking something up. And then all of a sudden, people get this position where we elicit something and they create something that looks very much like what would be called a kettlebell windmill or something. So without giving people these 15 different cues, what we try to do is create opportunities so that we can challenge these different positions and combinations of positions and capacities without bogging people down in all these rules and coaching. Um, you might use these in different contexts. Generally, the task-based training moves away from the top-down prescriptive points and gives people an opportunity to solve things. So rather than recreating the perfect deadlift that makes sense in the context of the gym, you set a movement challenge and see how people solve it. So generally, we do our task-based stuff when we were working with a population who have a broad goal or just kind of generally want to get better at interacting with the environment around them, whether it's older populations who just want to work on balance or confidence and things like that. And then sometimes we'll do more prescriptive things when we have a population who have a specific goal. So, for example, when we're working with Strong for Life, if we have people who want to work on improving bone mineral density in an evidence-based way, then we might provide that. Or if we're working with a group of people and they want to train, say, for a triathlon or something like that, then we might go ahead and do more of a top-down one, where generally what we do is really try to make most of our activities challenge-based. And it also just makes it much more fun to teach and coach. So, Jill, why don't you jump in?
Yeah, just to think about as you leave this, we've got lots more resources coming out, but um, just thinking about real activities, real life activities, and all of the benefits that come with them, and that often the fear of not doing something is more detrimental than the fear of doing something perfectly. And I think a lot of us can be held back with this idea that we might not be doing something correctly. And actually, there is a huge amount of wiggle room, and your body is capable of solving a lot of different problems if we can kind of create spaces where that feels safe and appropriate to do so. So a lot of the tasks that we do, particularly with Nature Moves, but across WildStrong, we'll be working with partners or in small groups, and actually really great creative solutions come out when people are just sort of chatting and not really thinking about the thing. So a lot of our courses are spent just kind of listening into what the groups are doing, and they come up with some brilliant stuff that we never would have come up with. Next slide, please, Andrew. You can rewatch this webinar. You can download the slides, we'll send them over. And just thinking more about sort of finding time to get some exploration in amongst everything else that you do. And it's nice once you start thinking about it, you can kind of become quite creative about how you move through your day. I've put some more resources here if you would like them. we do these monthly webinars. I put on the next slide actually was just if you've got suggestions for what you'd like us to research next, we're very happy to take suggestions. Um, yeah, you can join us for a course. Well, it's a bit of a moot point because we don't have any courses available at the moment, except for one. We've got a few spots in the Peak District in October, but we will have more courses. We're working to have more courses available um, very soon. Um, and there is some good reading. There's some, yeah, the really good one. I really enjoy the Todd Hargrove one. The one on the left, the Nonlinear Pedagogy and Athletic Skills Model, is a terrible title, but is a really good book.
Yeah, it's a very good book.
But
Um,
you have all of these slides if you want them.
yeah, a lot of what I said, I cribbed from one of these books or just from our own experience. So the Rob Gray one, I leaned on a lot for this. The Playing with Movement is very good. And those two other ones tend to be quite academic, but are very good if you can get past the really long titles.
And then just like I said, if you've got suggestions for next month's movement webinar, we were just thinking about that today. I like to have it up and ready for you, but we haven't thought about what it might be. So feel free to send us an email if you've got ideas. Has
More
anyone got
questions?
any questions before we go? I realize that we're just over time.
Um, let's see.
Okay.
Looks like we do have some good ones. Uh, so, Iqbal, I don't know if you saw at the beginning. I felt very bad about my AI images. I know you've complimented them. They were done on ChatGPT, but actually I felt really bad about using AI images, even though they did a good job of explaining. So I am trying to work with well, I am working with an artist now to recreate them. So hopefully in the future they'll be hand drawn. But that was ChatGPT that I use them for, and I was just trying to convey certain ideas really specifically. But thanks for asking that. Tonya, someone with severe scoliosis, chronic pain. I always have to learn from my own body during exercise. Very good. Or daily physical world. I'm interested in nature moves. Potential bring it. Yep. Yeah, Tonya, thanks for saying that. I think that is a really good example. Chronic pain, people really need to learn from their own experience, and often with chronic pain because it's so complex. Other people can give you tips and hints, but it's really an exploration process about what works for oneself. And I find that when people do have any sort of chronic pain condition, a lot of the top down or a lot of the textbook solutions for what people should be doing often aren't appropriate. And I think this exploratory model can be really, really helpful for people. So I'm glad that overlaps with your own experience. Rachel? I say, what happens if you try it this way instead? That's great. That's one of my favorite phrases as well. It's like, well, what happens if we did it this way? Give them a chance to see if it feels better or worse. Yeah, I think that's such a good example. There's all these little phrases that you can use. This idea of inviting people to try to do things, or let's give it a go and see what happens. Um, I did a course once, and the course instructor always used the word, "I've got a proposition for you. I propose that you try to solve this problem," and I thought that that was very good. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Mary. Thanks, Rachel. Um, yeah, again to Tony. Yeah, we have tried to work with different populations, and I think that obviously different populations have different needs. So the reason I'm saying that is that some of the games we do work really well, with example with neurodivergent populations, but sometimes some of the games we try to do is we try to get people comfortable with ambiguity or a little bit of chaos. And I found that with certain population groups of neurodivergent people, that you can't really lead with the chaos and the ambiguity. Obviously, certain groups of people would prefer to have more rules and things like that. So it's very interesting to see how you can sort of pull on different levers for design to find activities that are appropriate for different groups. Um, Heidi, yeah, there's a lot of good stuff, Heidi, that's also come out of drama. The way that a lot of drama and theater organizations talk about movement, I think is really interesting and dynamic, and it's a really nice contrast to some of the two-dimensional biomechanic models that you see out of strength and conditioning. Um, and yeah, I think that in general, I think some of the most interesting teachers who talk about movement come from a drama and theater background. So I'm glad that resonated with you. Kathy, yeah. Yeah, you'll notice that a lot of stuff does come from teacher training as well. So a lot of it, is from the student-centered, learner-centered stuff. Thank you, Mary. Okay. Any other questions from people? If you want, you can do, if you have time, you can go ahead and do it verbally if you want to take yourself off mute, or feel free to go ahead and put it into chat if you want. Otherwise, we'll just thank you very much for coming.
Yeah, thank you very much, guys. It's an unbelievably nice day out here. So we need to go out and
Yeah, I need to go get some fresh air.
yeah. All right, thanks, guys. Have a
Thanks,
good week.
everybody.